Gabrielle de Vietri has built a reputation as a fearless voice for change. As a Greens MP for Richmond in the Victorian Parliament, she's been a vocal advocate for social justice, intersectional feminism, and environmental action. From housing affordability to government accountability, she's never shied away from tough conversations. Ahead of the federal election, she shares her thoughts on why Labor is no longer the party it once was, the growing crackdown on the right to protest, and relentless pushback she faces as a progressive woman in politics. Here's our conversation. Gabrielle de Vietri, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks for being here.
You do incredible work. A lot of the social causes that you focus on, focus on empowering marginalised communities and women, and I just wanted to thank you for all your work.
Thank you. That means so much to hear that.
What does International Women's Day mean to you, firstly?
International Women's Day is a social and political movement. It's got history in the last century as being a moment where we recognise the incredible gains that we've made and the fights that we've had for equality, whether it's equal pay, whether it's the right to vote, whether it's healthcare. There's so many things that we've achieved. What it isn't is just a corporate opportunity for cupcakes and nice words without any kind of meaningful action underneath it. And I really push back against the kind of appropriation of International Women's Days for those empty gestures that we sometimes see. But it's also an opportunity for us to acknowledge how far we still have to go. Our parliaments are still incredibly masculinized spaces, incredibly lacking in diversity of all sorts. Women are still struggling to actually find equal footing in this world, and there are systems and decisions that are being made that ensure that continues to be the way. So we still have a lot to fight for. And change is happening at incredible pace around us. Change that kind of leads towards social collapse and leads towards deepening inequality, but also there's a huge amount of change that we can be responsible for and so much opportunity to fight for that change.
How important is allyship in this discussion? Because often, women of colour or women from marginalised communities or the LGBTQ community are often left out of the conversation. So how important is allyship in this discussion?
Well, it's so important that when we look at women's rights, we do so from an intersectional lens, because we can't have women's justice without justice for our LGBTIQA plus community, without justice for people of colour, without justice for trans and gender diverse people. So as long as we are looking at justice through an intersectional lens, then the fights that we have are fights for equality and justice for everybody. But if we're looking at it purely through a singular lens, then we're likely to repeat the discriminatory and hierarchical and unjust systems that have led to women being oppressed all over again.
Yeah. What role do white women have in dismantling systemic barriers that sort of keep women of colour and women from the LGBTQIA community oppressed?
As long as we fight oppression from only one perspective, we're going to end up replicating the same systems of oppression that we're trying to break free from. And so there have been rightly criticisms of, white feminism being unable to branch out to look at the intersectional ways in which we all must fight structural oppression. So I think that white women in this space trying to fight the patriarchy, fighting discrimination, fighting oppression, must do so in a way that encompasses all of our struggles, because we can't have justice for just one group. That's always going to replicate those kind of systemic problems. So as a white woman, as a woman with privilege, I see it as my role to enable, empower, listen, understand, and work with those people who are continuing to experience systemic injustice, people from our LGBTIQA plus community, women of colour especially, and make sure that our fights are all interconnected. It's not just the fight for women, for trans and gender diverse communities, for women of colour, but it's a fight to stop the militarisation of our governments, to stop the over-policing of marginalised communities, to stop the ecological collapse that corporate greed is responsible for. All these injustices are all interlinked. And so kind of zooming out and understanding one injustice as an injustice for everyone is critical to being able to be a good ally and speak not just from a singular perspective.
Women of colour and from marginalised communities are often told to stay in their lane, especially when they're pursuing, speaking out against injustice and fighting for, fairness and freedom. Have you ever been told to stay in your lane, and how do you deal with the pushback?
I am told on a daily basis to stay in my lane, whether it's from, government politicians or members of the public or the media, constantly being told that I'm wrong, that I'm out of my depth, that I'm not, meant to be doing what I am told by my community that I'm meant to be doing, and what I believe I'm meant to be doing, because I'm following my values and I'm following ethics and I'm following the core beliefs of the Greens, which is, social justice, which is ecological sustainability, which is peace and non-violence and grassroots democracy. Those are the things that guide me. And so I've got that deep in my guts, and I've learned over the course of, coming into politics to trust my intuition, and particularly for women and women of colour and people who have, who often get the brunt of being dismissed and cast aside and told to stay in their lane. My biggest piece of advice is trust your intuition, because it is such a powerful guiding force, and it is so often right. And as I've learned to do that more and more, I've realised actually how powerful that is.
The federal election is set to come up, and we're expecting an announcement any day now. Some people argue that political parties often only engage with multicultural communities or people from the LGBTQ community when they need votes, and that it's not always sincere. What are your thoughts on that?
Having been in Parliament now for 2 years, I can tell you that I am so kind of disgusted and disappointed by our political system that breeds that kind of, cheap engagement for continued power. Both parties, both major parties, the Liberals and Labor, are shameless in the way that they make policies and make decisions just to enable their own pursuit of power and their continued pursuit of power at any cost. It's no wonder that people have lost faith in politicians, and people don't believe that politics can do anything. And sitting in that parliament which was made for old white men and still exists for that kind of patriarchal oppressive power, I'm not surprised that that's the way that most people in the public feel. The experience that I've had in Parliament has been so eye-opening, where institutionalised bullying and intimidation is just par for the course. It's an everyday experience, and when I stand up and speak out against the genocide of Palestinian people, when I stand up and rail against the demolition and privatisation of our public housing communities, when I speak up and talk about the things that our community is crying out to be heard, I get nothing but jeers and abuse from 84 members of that parliament from all sides. And no wonder we don't have more women and more people of colour putting their hand up to occupy those seats, because it is an intimidating, oppressive, colonial structure. And so to fix that, we need to not just replace the people in there with people who actually are truly representative of their community and who'll do the job that they've been given with principles and with their community in mind, but we actually need to dismantle that system and recreate a system that takes into account First Nations sovereignty, that is there to truly represent our community and not just, career politicians who feel entitled to the job. And so I see it as my role to elevate other people and to make it clear that those seats in Parliament are not reserved for them, that it's actually, those seats are for all of us.
Yeah.
And if I can find my way from being a kind of, Kalgoorlie born, relatively rootless person to being an artist to being thrust into this politician's life, then I can help other people find their way as well. And I think bridging that gap between what happens in the public and what happens in Parliament is part of the role, the privilege that I've been given and the responsibility that I have to actually bring other people into that space and change the way it works.
Yeah. What's your advice to someone who may not be too excited about the candidates that we have going into the next election? What's your advice? What should they do, especially younger voters?
Well, democracy doesn't just happen once every few years when you cast your ballot. There are so many exciting, effective, impactful ways that a person can get involved in politics. And you can change the course of the future by doing so. Casting a ballot is super important. Your vote is really important, and it's really important to understand the preferential voting system, where you don't have to put one of the major parties first. You can put who you align with first, and because of our system, it flows on to the next person and the next person until one candidate has a majority of votes. But aside from voting, turning up and organising in your community, mobilising people for the things that you believe in is so important, because politicians without that will make decisions based on the strongest lobbyists and the loudest voices and the people with the money. So every time politicians from the two major parties make a decision, they're weighing up the voices of the lobbyists and their donors and the weight of public opinion. And if public opinion is not loud enough, they will just turn to their lobbyists, the property council, the gambling lobby, the fossil fuel companies, the loudest voices that hold the power. And so our communities will benefit so much from collectivizing and working together, whether it's the public housing communities, whether it's the pro-Palestinian communities, whether it's like other marginalised and oppressed communities, or people who feel like the government is not making decisions in the best interests of their future and their children's future. That's where people are so powerful. Whether it's just writing to your MP, or whether it's turning up to a rally, or whether it's engaging with the parliamentary system between elections, those things are incredibly powerful things to do. And I feel like it's especially important now that we exercise all of those democratic rights aside from voting, or as well as voting, because right now governments around the world and even our Victorian Parliament is trying to crack down on the right to protest because they find it so threatening. And so many of our rights have been gained through protest, whether we're looking at the right to vote, equal pay, the 40-hour working week, the end to South African apartheid, so civil rights movement. So many things have been gained through principled, persistent civil disobedience. And right now the Victorian government is trying to crack down on that because they know how valuable it has been for this movement, global movement for peace, that they absolutely want to silence. So they're trying to stop protests near places of worship, which is pretty much anywhere in town. They're trying to stop people from wearing face coverings after telling us we all had to wear face coverings. They're trying to ban glue, ropes and chains, which are often used in environmental protests to stop, ancient hundreds of years old trees from being logged. And they're also forcing multicultural organisations to sign a social cohesion pledge just to apply for funding, which is just so kind of unbelievable as a kind of method of controlling and coercing diverse communities to comply with the government of the day. And it's really, really dangerous. So many of the things, even here, like the first Australian woman to speak in Parliament, went over to England when our Parliament was still over there, and had to chain herself to the public gallery just to get through her speech to be heard. And shortly after that, we had a shift where we had our first female politician elected to Parliament. There's a statue actually that was unveiled just a few years ago by our government of Zelda de Prano, who's standing there with her chains in her protest for equal pay. Zelda de Prano was a Jewish woman, a unionist who was fighting for equal pay for women. And today, the very same Labor government that unveiled that statue would be criminalising her for bringing a chain to make her point and fight for justice, fight for equal rights.
Doesn't this kind of go against the very foundation that makes Labor Labor?
Yes, I think a lot of people have been noticing that Labor is not who they used to be. You know, Labor is not the party of Gough Whitlam anymore. A lot of Labor members still hold those values really tight, but Labor has completely lost their way, and now they're taking away work cover rights for people who have suffered injury. They are working against the world peace and the Palestinian self-determination that they had always said that they supported. They are tearing down public housing and giving that land away to private developers because of the value of the land. They're privatising our public services. They're, engaging in behaviour that we would never have thought a Labor government would have endorsed, and yet they're doing this by stealth, and they're doing it because they're not listening to their members, they're not listening to their community, they're listening to their lobbyists, they're listening to the corporations, and they're listening to their donors that will fund their next election campaign.
So what's behind this, in your opinion? Is it money?
Yes, I think they've lost sight of why they're there. They have this kind of power at all costs mentality. They think that as long as they're just marginally better than the coalition, then they deserve to stay in power. But it's just not going to cut it, especially not now with a superpower that is kind of wreaking havoc across our globe. And not when we're facing kind of ecological collapse as well. We need our parties, we need our governments to approach this world with a clear conscience and with strong principles, but they've got scared. They've got scared to take a step in either direction because they just want to be a small target, they want to get to the next election, they want to stay in power, and they just don't really know what they stand for anymore. Which is where a strong crossbench comes into play, and which is where the Greens come into play, because we, unlike the major parties, have these guiding pillars that are the foundation of everything that we do, and every decision comes back to whether it sustains or works against those four guiding principles. And that's what guides me. And when we have a strong crossbench, we're able to negotiate every single piece of legislation. We're able to put things on the table, and we're able to force the government to actually take into consideration what the communities are saying and to negotiate with, a progressive party that holds the balance of power.
It's almost hard to differentiate Labor from Liberal these days. A lot of the policies tend to be very similar. How easy is it to sort of negotiate with these major parties for the Greens when, a lot of what they do, a lot of the ideologies are the same?
Well, a lot of what Labor does reinforces to us that they would rather Liberals be in power and reinforce the two-party supremacy than actually make the democratic move and allow people to vote in a strong crossbench. They consistently make donation rules and electoral rules that reinforce the two-party system. And when they have the support of the Liberals to do that, well, it's easy to pass laws. But more and more people are turning away from the two-party system. They recognise that, like you said, they're getting closer and closer together politically, and they no longer represent the interests of the everyday person. And when that happens, as we've seen, when we hold the balance of power right now, as we do in the upper house in both the federal and the Victorian Parliament, they are forced to negotiate with us when the Liberals don't support their bills. And that puts us in a position where we can improve legislation, where we can ask for particular movements in exchange for supporting a bill, and that's when we get progress. And when the Greens are able to wield more of that power, then we're able to form minority government. We're able to press for even more of those progressive changes to protect the environment, to make sure that everyone has a secure and affordable home to live in, to bring down the cost of living and bring down corporate greed, tax the big banks, hold the big supermarkets accountable for their price gouging. Those are the kinds of things that the Greens will push to do. And when we have the balance of power in both houses, then we'll be able to do that. And the government won't have a choice as to whether they negotiate with us or not. They'll have to.
Thank goodness for the Greens.
That's what I think too. When you're in the Parliament and you just have, they're so disconnected from the real world, and you come from the real world where everyone's like, oh yeah, I agree with you, that is my value as well, like those are my values as well. And then you get into Parliament and they just seem, I don't know if the Premier's even ever spoken to a constituent. She seems so disconnected. She's been a politician for 26 years, more than half of her life, and just seems to be so kind of blinkered into this this idea of the world that's centered in this very bizarre universe that is Parliament. You just kind of you realize how important it is to have these progressive voices and an alternative view of what's happening and an alternative narrative for what is possible, because we're the only ones in there saying it.
Yes.
Yeah.
The party of sanity.
Yes, that should be our byline.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much, Gabrielle. I appreciate your time.